Europe calls this a historic opportunity. These farmers call it a betrayal. They are protesting the EU-Mercosur Deal, one of the most controversial trade agreements Europe has signed in decades. On paper, the EU-Mercosur deal looks like a win. New markets, lower tariffs, more exports, and cheaper trade. It connects Europe with South America in a market of more than 700 million people. So why are people on the streets all over Europe fighting so hard to stop it? In Poland, Spain, France, or Belgium. And these are only a few examples. Across Europe, farmers did not see this deal as an opportunity. They saw it as a threat. Because to them, the EU-Mercosur deal has a very different meaning. While European industry gets access to South America, European agriculture gets more competition from Brazil, one of the most powerful agricultural exporters on our planet. And that is why this deal is not just about trade. It is about what Europe gains and who might carry the cost. But before we decide whether the farmers are right, we need to understand what Europe actually signed and why it took more than 2 decades to get here. At the center of this deal is Mercosur. The name itself tells you what it was supposed to be. Mercosur is short for Mercado Común del Sur, Spanish for Southern Common Market. It was created in 1991 by Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The idea was simple: turn a part of South America into a shared economic space, with fewer barriers between member countries, a common external trade policy, and more bargaining power in the global economy. In a very loose sense, you can think of it as South America's attempt to build something like a common market. Not as deep as the European Union, but with the same basic direction: economic integration. Today, Mercosur has expanded beyond its original 4 members. Bolivia became a full member in 2024, while Venezuela remains suspended. While Bolivia is now part of Mercosur as a bloc, it is not part of the specific EU-Mercosur trade agreement. And even without Bolivia, this is not a small partner. Mercosur is a market of around 270 million people, but its real weight is not just population, it is production power. Brazil alone accounts for more than half of global soybean exports. It is also the world's largest beef exporter, with roughly a quarter of global beef exports. And Brazil is one of the most dominant players in the global poultry trade as well. So when European farmers hear Mercosur, they do not just hear new market. They hear one of the most competitive agricultural regions on our planet. And that creates a fundamental asymmetry. For Europe, this deal is an industrial strategy, and for Mercosur, it's an agricultural one. But if the economic trade-off, machines for meat, seems so straightforward, why did it take 25 years to cross the finish line? On paper, negotiations are technical: quotas, transition periods, and product categories. But in reality, this deal was stuck in triple deadlock: standards, sustainability, and sovereignty. First, the standards. European farmers aren't just competing with South American prices, they are competing with a different regulatory philosophy. From pesticides to animal welfare, the gap between EU requirements and Mercosur practices created a political firestorm, without a way to guarantee that a Brazilian steak followed the same rules as a French one. The deal was a non-starter. Second, the Amazon. In 2019, when both sides finally reached an agreement in principle, the world looked quite different. But as deforestation rates in the tropics climbed, the deal became toxic. It wasn't just a trade agreement anymore, it was seen as a potential subsidy for environmental destruction. Finally, the sovereignty trap. For Mercosur, Europe's demand for green safeguards felt like green protectionism, a way for Brussels to dictate how South American nations should manage their own land. By 2020, the deal was effectively dead. It was stuck in the gap between economic logic and political trust. So what changed? The world did. The old logic of globalization was efficiency: produce where it's cheapest. The new logic is resilience: produce where it's safest. As China's influence in South America surged and the United States turned inward, the EU-Mercosur deal stopped being just about trade. It became a geopolitical necessity. It's no longer just about the price of beef or the cost of a car. It's about de-risking Europe's future. It's about securing the critical minerals for the green transition and ensuring that in a fragmented world, Europe still has partners it can rely on. In December 2024, after 2 decades of hesitation, Europe decided that the cost of the deal was finally lower than the cost of standing alone. Because when you move from the history to the ledger, the pro-deal column is staggering. To understand the scale, look at the tariff wars that existed before May 2026. We are talking about a massive distortion of trade. European car manufacturers were facing a 35% tariff in Mercosur. Machinery was hit with up to 20 and chemicals with 18%. For a German automaker or a French pharmaceutical giant, this deal isn't just gross. It's removal of an annual €4 billion tax on European engineering. By 2040, the European Commission's models project a GDP expansion of €77 billion. But more importantly, EU exports to the region are expected to surge by almost 40%. That's an additional €50 billion in annual trade volume, supporting over 600,000 jobs across the entire continent. But trade is a zero-sum game in the eyes of those who carry the costs. While industry celebrates removal of tariffs, the agricultural sector is looking at a different set of numbers. The import quotas, 99,000 tons of beef at a reduced 7.5% tariff, 180,000 tons of poultry, and 190,000 tons of sugar enters duty-free. The EU's defense is a macroeconomic one. The beef quota represents just 1.5% of total EU production. This sounds very slim. But in economics, especially when it comes to commodities, the price is set at the margin. To see how dangerous that can be, let's take a look at the 2015 dairy crisis. For 31 years, Europe controlled its milk supply through a quota system, essentially a production brake, that prevented farmers from flooding the market to keep prices artificially stable. When that brake was released in April 2015, the market didn't explode. Total EU milk production increased by about 2 to 4%. On a spreadsheet, that looks like a minor adjustment. But in a market where everyone already has enough milk, that extra 2% has nowhere to go. And the intuition is simple. Since we can't suddenly drink twice as much milk just because it's cheaper, even a tiny surplus forces producers to slash prices aggressively just to find a buyer. In Germany, the price for raw milk plummeted from around 40 cents per kilogram in 2014 to less than 23 cents by 2016, a devastating 45% drop triggered by a single-digit increase in supply. It was a systematic collapse that forced the European Commission to step in with a €500 million emergency bailout. This is why farmers don't hear 1.5% as a harmless number. They know that in a low-margin business with inelastic demand, a 1.5% shift in supply isn't just a statistic, it's a potential price for collapse. They've seen this movie before. But there's a reason Brussels pushed through the protest in 2026. It's called supply chain sovereignty. Mercosur isn't just about what they sell us, it's about what they control. Brazil produces about 93% of the world's niobium. It's a critical input for high-strength steel and the aerospace industry. On the other hand, Argentina sits on a massive portion of the lithium triangle, one of the biggest lithium deposits in the world. In the end, it is a strategic hedge. Brussels has essentially decided to trade a portion of its agricultural market for guaranteed access to the raw materials of the green transition. This is the very cold logic of the deal. The benefits are systematic, industrial, and long-term. The costs are sectoral, agricultural, and immediate. Brussels calls it a historic opportunity. Farmers call it a betrayal. Neither are wrong. They are just reacting to different columns of the same spreadsheet. In the end, the EU-Mercosur agreement is more than just a trade deal. It's a monument to the end of an era. For decades, Europe's trade policy was guided by a mantra that has recently become infamous: Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. It was the same logic Europe applied to Russia for 30 years, the belief that economic interdependence would automatically lead to shared values and global stability. We now know how that story ended. The pipelines are dry, the trust is long gone, and the geopolitical cost of that dependency has been staggering. But as of May 2026, the EU-Mercosur Deal shows us that Brussels hasn't abandoned the idea of trade. It has simply stripped it of its optimism. This isn't a mission to transform South America into a mirror of Europe. This is de-risking. It is a calculated transactional move to ensure that when the next geopolitical storm hits, Europe isn't left standing alone, without the minerals it needs to survive. From a pure macroeconomic perspective, the deal is a logic necessity. In a world where trade is being used as a weapon, Europe is hedging its bets. It is trading access to its dinner plates for access to the mines of the future. But economics is never just about the aggregate. It is about distribution. If the gains of globalization continue to flow to the industrial hubs while the costs are dumped on the rural periphery, the political backlash won't stop at the tractors in the streets. It will end up in the ballot boxes. If we only look at the projected 77 billion euro GDP gain, we ignore a fundamental truth of the Dismal science. GDP doesn't buy a new tractor for a struggling farmer somewhere in the Pyrenees. The EU-Mercosur deal is a victory for European strategic sovereignty. It secures supply chains and opens doors for high-tech exports. But it also leaves us with the most difficult question of all. How do we build a resilient global economy without breaking the local communities that have to sustain it? The conflict between economic logic and political trust is far from over. Because in the end, the hardest thing to balance isn't the tariff schedule, it's the people. Thank you for watching my video. Feel free to comment any feedback, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this content in the future. Have a good one. Cheers.